The core difference between the ancient system of the Greek warring states, and you're from India, you also have the Indian warring states, over any warring state system in the world back in history, and the system today is the existence of nuclear weapons, right? Today, the number one theory, the theory of a battle of annihilation, it's out of the question. Why? Because of mutual assured destruction. There's no way for the Americans and the Chinese to fight a direct war. If they fight a direct war, we might end up with a nuclear war. And in the era of nuclear revolution, no country can win a nuclear war. So that's my argument why the Thucydides trap is a lot of, it's kind of facile analogizing.
Mistrust on both sides, considering the security dilemma that exists. On one hand, the US with the Indo-Pacific strategy. On the other hand, China with its own BRI initiative that's viewed very differently in the US.
China is ring-fenced, the first island chain, the second island chain. So you have this huge economy, 1.4 billion people, and they're very vulnerable. Their sea lines of communications are very vulnerable because the US Navy and US allies in the region, they can, in a sense, cut those sea lines off. And that means China might not have access to energy, it might not have access to food, it might not have access to resources that it needs for its economy to operate. And that creates a lot of fear. If you're a Chinese statesman, if you are the Zhongnanhai and you're looking across, or you're looking on the map, you're very scared that the other side might do that, might interdict your sea lines of communication.
We are living in a highly volatile world today. On one hand, we have a war in Europe, which was unexpected. And on the other hand, we have the conflict in Middle East. And yet in today's time, another aspect that is being looked upon by various researchers, scholars, and geopolitical analysts all over the world, it's the U.S.-China relation. I have with me right now Professor Vasilis Trigkas, who's the visiting assistant professor at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University, and he's also the elected fellow for Council of International Relations in Greece. And we are going to be talking about his research paper on US-China relations and the Thucydides trap. The word has become very common in today's time. What is his interpretation of it, and how does the US-China relations fit into that perspective? So Professor Vasilis, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Well, thank you, Pallavi. It's always refreshing to talk with a very young scholar, a Schwarzman scholar from India, and hopefully having this outreach to the most populous country in the world today.
And regarding your research, and especially when you think about the Thucydides history of Peloponnesian War, then recently there's a numberage of articles written about US-China relations and the Thucydides trap. You say in your research that that's a misrepresentation. How so?
Right. So, the amazing thing with Thucydides is that the author, who was born a few kilometers from where I was born in Athens, about 2,500 years ago, foresaw the perennial influence of his work. So if you read Thucydides, he himself say that his work was not written to catch the applause of the moment, but as a work for all times, because human nature never changes. And as long as human nature is a constant, then the concepts which Thucydides introduced about war and peace, about great power competition, remain evident, remain prevalent, right? So, when you have the rise of a power which challenges the influence, the hegemony of an established power, so the structural change, right? Rising power, established powers. This is a core thesis in Thucydides, and this is what Professor Graham Allison captures, that when you have, Athens rising, then there is fear, and fear made Sparta uncomfortable, and Sparta-Athenian relations become terrible in a sense, and at the end you had war. This is the structural dimension. However, if you read Thucydides, you'll see that war was not based on inadvertent escalation, which is the core concept of the so-called Thucydides trap today. It was rather a calculated decision. So you had the Athenian statesman and you had the Spartan statesman, and they had different theories of victory, right? And they chose the theories of victory, and based on the theories of victory, they decided for war. To be more specific, Athens was a naval power, all right? It was surrounded by walls. It had the long walls connecting the city with the port of Piraeus, right? And it had a fleet of about 200 to 300 triremes. That was the ships of the day, the naval boats of the day. And therefore, Athens was some kind of an island with formidable naval power, all right? Sparta was a land power. It had no walls, it had no navy, but it had a very formidable land force. And so when there was the decision for war, the Spartans said, we're going to march to Athens, we're going to crush the Athenian army in one decisive battle of annihilation, and then we won, the war ends, that's the perpetuation of the Spartan Empire. Athens is no longer a hegemonic threat. The Athenians, on the other hand, realized that they didn't have to fight a battle on land, right? They would hide behind the walls and they would use their navy to attreat the Spartans. So the Athenian theory of victory was based on a prolonged war of attrition. The Spartan theory of victory was based on a battle of annihilation. Two different concepts. Each side believed those concepts were correct. Therefore, they thought they would fight the war. And the war they fought. So there was no issue of inadvertence, that neither side wanted the war, and because of accident, because of miscalculation, the war occurred. That is the Peloponnesian War. Complexity, strategic decision-making, two sides, conflicting interests, political objectives, two sides decide for war.
But do you think, given the explanation you just gave of the Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, in today's time, when you look at U.S.-China relations, one has a powerful navy and one has a powerful land force, one has a good economy and the other has like the great military strength. Don't you think that the similar kinds of elements can be seen in U.S.-China relations today as well?
Right. So look, first of all, back in the Peloponnesian War, Sparta was not an economic power. Today, both the U.S. and the Chinese are economic powers. Maybe the Chinese have become more of an economic power lately, but the U.S. has serious structural economic advantages, the U.S. dollar, network centricity, and so on. So these are both economic powers. The core difference between the ancient system of the Greek warring states, and you're from India, you also have the Indian warring states, over any warring state system in the world back in history, and the system today is the existence of nuclear weapons, right? So when the Athenians and the Spartans, as I said, were strategizing for war, each side had a theory of victory. The Spartans, battle of annihilation, the Athenians, prolonged war of attrition. Today, the number one theory, the theory of a battle of annihilation, it's out of the question. Why? Because of mutual assured destruction. There's no way for the Americans and the Chinese to fight a direct war. If they fight a direct war, we might end up with a nuclear war. And in the era of nuclear revolution, no country can win a nuclear war. So that's my argument why the Thucydides trap is a lot of, it's kind of facile analogizing. When we talk about Thucydides, we need to read the text and we need to do what Fitzgerald College, it's Fitzgerald College, Cambridge motto, ex novissimis and antiquis optima, the best of the old, the best of the new. Right? So what is the old? The idea of clashing objectives, competition for hegemony, different states struggling for power. This is always there, has always been there, and it's still here. But what is the new? Nuclear weapons. And this changes the calculation about victory.
But your argument is that rational statesmen like both US and China, rational powers, rational people would not resort to nuclear war because of mutual assured destruction. But just looking back at the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had rational statesmen even then, and yet the world came really, really close to a nuclear war even then.
Yes.
So what changes things?
Right. So first of all, it took some time for the rational statesman, for the rational state, and I think every state is rational in IR, in international relations, to understand the danger of nuclear war, right? Brinkmanship, the dangers of brinkmanship. When you take the two states, the two leaders close to the brink, they might accidentally fall off the brink, right? So it took some time, and actually the Cuban Missile Crisis was we had other nuclear crises, but it was the peak, in a sense, of the Cold War, all right? But it was not a Cold War. It was not a nuclear war. The crisis did not end in a nuclear war, and this is because JFK, who's a leader that I very much admire, he saw what would occur and he didn't accept the advice of his generals, right, to invade and bomb Cuba. And we know that actually there were nuclear weapons in Cuba. The U.S. side was not certain about the utility of those nuclear weapons, and so Kennedy made the right choice, the prudent choice. And this is also a concept in Thucydides. We call this sophrosine. Sophrosine means you have to, when you compete with great powers, you have to set guardrails, right? You compete within a path, within a corridor. Outside of this corridor, there are things you should not be doing, because if you do those things, you are escalating the competition, you're escalating the rivalry, and you're coming closer to an all-out war. And we don't want to see that in an era of mutual assured destruction and nuclear weapons, with the U.S. and the United States and also Russia increasing, actually, that's a sad story, increasing their nuclear arsenal right now as we're speaking.
But if all-out war is not possible, but also there are mistrust on both sides, considering the security dilemma that exists. On one hand, the US with the Indo-Pacific strategy, on the other hand, China with its own BRI initiative that's viewed very differently in the US. When you have these kinds of action on parts of both great powers, then the escalation, it is felt that the escalation is inevitable. What do you do in kind of like that kind of security dilemma?
No, escalation is not inevitable, but let me just frame a little bit the security dilemma, which is something very important here. So China is ring-fenced, the first island chain, the second island chain. So you have this huge economy, 1.4 billion people, and they're very vulnerable. Their sea lines of communications are very vulnerable because the U.S. Navy and U.S. allies in the region, they can, in a sense, cut those sea lines off in a dangerous situation, and that means China might not have access to energy, it might not have access to food, it might not have access to resources that it needs for its economy to operate. In a sense, it's very different than Russia, because Russia has the resources, China doesn't have the resources. And that creates a lot of fear. If you're a Chinese statesman, if you are the Zhongnanhai and you're looking across, so you're looking on the map, you're very scared that the other side might do that, might interdict your sea lines of communication. And what's the response? My view in my article is that the Belt and Road Initiative is a response to China being ring-fenced from the first island chain. And so instead of increasing its naval posture and perhaps having a very serious naval competition against Japan, the United States, in the East China Sea, China is pouring resources in Eurasia, on land mostly, to integrate Eurasia and ensure that in the case of a naval blockade, China would have access through pipelines and railways to resources from Eurasia to support its economy, right? So that's the security dilemma. But for your first question, when it comes to, you don't fight wars, how do you compete? Well, we are realists, at least I'm a realist, so, China and the U.S. are going to compete. The question is, how intense is this competition going to be? And I think there are some red lines that the two sides should not cross. The idea of infiltrating the other side and trying to destabilize the other society. The idea of trying to delegitimate the political system. The idea of using ideology as a gun, right, to undermine the cohesion and the vibrance and the unity of the other society. I think if both sides respect what we term core national interest and national sovereignty, there is a probability of intense competition, but not outright rivalry. Right? And again, this is the concept of sophrosine. This is the concept of prudence, the guardrails, right? Because we have to see in the 21st century national security not just as domestic absolute security, but as encompassing security transcending national borders. Take financial stability. This is national security. Take pandemic. Preventing the next pandemic or managing the next pandemic, hopefully much better than COVID-19. This is national security. Take climate change, global warming. This is national security. So in a sense, those three core issues, financial stability, pandemic control, global change, and of course, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, fourth issue, cannot operate without having China and the United States sitting down together and talking with prudence about how to address those consequential issues that transcend national borders.
If you hear diplomats from both the US and China, they also refer to this, that we are not living in the Cold War era. This is not the Cold War. There are no like spheres of influence that people need to talk about. But when you see in reality, you do have both the countries trying to find more allies if they can, with China trying to expand BRICS as much as possible, and the US creating like Quad and AUKUS and all these military alliances. You still see that kind of reflection of Cold War in these incidents. And one aspect of Cold War is the proxy wars. Do you think like with the US-China relations, if like all-out war is not possible and yet intense competition is, what's the possibility of a proxy war?
Wow, I mean, look, balancing is a natural phenomenon in international relations theory. When you have a rising power, countries around that rising power feel uncomfortable. We might think of the elevator analogy. Imagine that you have an elevator, and this elevator is packed with people, and then it stops at a certain floor, and a big person tries to enter the elevator. No matter how kind that person is, people within the elevator, because of limited space, they're going to feel uncomfortable. So China has been rising, and you have countries like India, countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, that they feel a bit scared about the future Chinese intentions because of increasing Chinese capabilities, right? And so that creates tendencies of balancing, but balancing it's not bad as long as, again, as there's communication, there's engagement. Take of the ASEAN model and the ways ASEAN have been talking to China or engaging with China. This is a bit different from the ways, for instance, Japan, right, has been engaging with China, sadly, lately, much more securitized environment. Take Vietnam. Right? The two conditions for becoming a Vietnamese president is, first of all, you have to stand up to China. Second of all, you have to know how to work with China. So I think it's more complicated. We do see balancing. This is not an outcome of a Cold War. It's an outcome of what we call rising power. And so in my understanding, the way China is going to behave and the way China is going to limit the threat perceptions of its increasing power to the region by perhaps investing more, building more connectivity, and avoiding some wolf warrior, arguments and diplomacy, and being more prudent to its relations with India, with ASEAN, with East Asia, that can deliver significant strategic benefits for China and for the region. So avoid intense balancing.
But for possibilities of proxy war, because on one hand, there's also conversation around like that China did supply weapons to Russia. And currently we have like a conflict in Middle East, and there are other wars that are happening that have nothing to do with US-China, but once US-China get involved, then it could turn into a proxy war. So what's the possibility of that happening?
Right. Well, first of all, yes, you're absolutely right. In my article, by the way, it's a co-authored article with Professor Platias from University of Piraeus. Proxy war is a criterion for a Cold War. So if we observe proxy wars, we're very close to seeing a Cold War because, as you said, nuclear powers do not fight direct wars. Oh, that means they can fight a proxy war, right? And so people say the Ukraine war is a proxy war. I have to say we're at the beginning of that process. If you take, let's say, the Vietnam War, which was a proxy war, or if you take the Afghan War of the 80s, which was also a proxy war, I would say the engagement of every side was much more intense than it is today in Ukraine. And so you have China perhaps doing business with Russia, but China, as far as we know, does not really provide any military materials. So China is buying energy from Russia and does trade, exporting cars and perhaps some other dual-use equipment, but not military equipment per se. But then you have India too, and India is doing has great commercial relations with Russia. 90% of the world has great commercial relations with Russia. So we haven't, except for, you have North Korea providing weapons and Iran maybe, but we're not yet there of China becoming a co-belligerent or a clear supporter of Russia in Ukraine by providing military weapons. We haven't seen that. And as long as we don't have that, I don't think we can use the proxy war analogy to go back and say, oh, this is a new Cold War. Although we're getting close, and I hope prudence will prevail, and we're not going to end up with serious proxy wars across the world. And let me just remind you that the Cold War was not peaceful for the Third World. Most of the Africans and the South Americans, they fought bloody wars because of great powers using those countries as pawns for the grand strategic competition. So if we need to be prudent, one thing we should be doing is to prevent the use of proxy wars, to avoid proxy wars and let the global South sustain strong development.
Why do you think it is in China's strategic interest to not be involved in a proxy war right now? Do you think it is the idea that they do not want to be engaged in a military conflict, even indirectly anywhere? Or it's more about, like Deng Xiaoping said, lay low and bide your time?
Yes. Well, first of all, I have to say, I admire Deng Xiaoping. He was a great statesman. He made basically China great again. And I think from the Chinese perspective, engaging in a direct proxy war in Ukraine would lead to a serious deterioration in China's relationship with Europe, right? So the Chinese do not want to see that. They have this very special relationship with Russia. They call it strategic kind of partnership. It's not a security treaty, but at the same time, the Chinese have very close relations with most of Europe, with Western Europe, Germany, France, Greece, the port, many other countries. So they wouldn't go there out of a strategic consideration. And of course, also the approach of not engaging in wars across the world. The last war that China fought was in 1979 with Vietnam. So I think that's a deep strategic belief in the Chinese mindset to avoid any kind of entanglement in foreign wars.
But ideologically, you see US and China on completely different spectrum when it comes to either the ideas of democracy or economic systems. You have US and China on the opposite sides of the spectrum. So when such kind of ideological shifts exist, and you recently have President Xi Jinping talk about the China development model, and US perceiving it as China trying to export its ideology across borders. In that kind of situation, do you think that just the ideological conflict will also create more strain on the US-China relations? Or in today's time, when economic interests overpower everything else, ideology doesn't matter as much?
Yeah, so Xi Jinping mentioned that in 2017 at the Party Congress, and I remember there was kind of a fear in the US that China will begin exporting its model. But what President Xi said, I think, is that there might be something in the way of Chinese modernization that other countries could learn from. He never said, we're going to other countries and impose our model. And this is very different from the Soviet Union era, where you have the Moscow with the ideological perception of the world, going to Greece, going to Bulgaria, going to Poland, going to Hungary, and then changing the government there and imposing communist regimes that would be allies with Russia, with Moscow, the Soviet Union, and then they would change the system of that country. Let's say I'm from Greece, and we have changed a lot of governments in the past 10 years. We had the left government, we had the right government. China has never had any problems working with any side. So I think my understanding is that the Chinese are pragmatic, and the idea of this war of democracies against autocracies, the ideologization of great power competition, get us back to the first point, that when you have nuclear weapons, you don't want to distort reality. You don't want to frame your adversary as evil. This is what JFK mentioned in his 1963 American University speech, June 1963, when he mentioned that we shouldn't turn the adversary into a master. We should try to understand what they are, what their interests are, and then based on that, try to engage. Because if we push the other side to the point that either of a humiliating defeat or a nuclear war, only those two outcomes, then we might end up with a nuclear war. So you don't want to do that. So my point is, ideology is a distortive lens that undermines China-US relations. And ideology can be used by both sides, right? The Americans might use ideology to frame the Chinese as extremist, despotic, authoritarian. and therefore allow no space for engagement. You have a lot of narratives about social credit scores in China. You are in China, there's no such a thing, for instance, but many people in the social media believe that if you don't have a credit score, you can't eat. Right? These are all ideological narratives that undermine dialogue. And from the Chinese perspective, the idea that the U.S. is a failing society, that it's all about the capitalist, it's all about identity politics and all those. Yes, the U.S. has problems, but it remains a society which attracts global talent and a very, very solid state. So ideology is a distortive lens, and prudent statesmen do not need ideology when they do diplomacy. They need more sincere and prudent talk. And this is important when you have mutual assured distraction and nuclear weapons in the room.
But what about the role of domestic politics in all of these, when you have leaders who are also trying to appease their own population and trying to portray an image of them always taking care of their own national interests? So on one hand, you see in China this rising wave of nationalism, and on the other hand, in the US, you have the upcoming elections, and every time, like we've heard diplomats say this, we've had other people say this behind closed doors, that every time US elections come, China is always an issue that is rigged up. So in case of domestic politics, do you see the US-China relations getting worse just because of those domestic circumstances as well?
Well, Pallavi, back at the beginning of the First Cold War, Senator Vandenberg said that if the U.S. wanted to mobilize to contain the Soviet Union, then the American elites should scare the American society and inflate the Soviet fear. I'm not sure if that was the prudent thing back then, because it happened, but that led us to the communist, the ostracism of left-wing intellectuals from the federal government, McCarthyism. Eventually, it took us to the
domino theory.
Yes, domino theory, exactly. It took us to the missile crisis, Cuban crisis. So if the U.S. thinks that the Chinese fear can be inflated so that it does nation building at home, I think in 2024, this is going to have very negative consequences, both for the U.S., for China-U.S. relations, and for the world. So I think the Chinese are not doing it that much. Of course, they are seeing some American initiatives like the embargo on microchips, and they understand there's this quasi-containment strategy. But from a U.S. perspective, this is my fear, the belief that it's only the Chinese threat, inflated on triple steroids, that is necessary so that all the cleavages within the American society can be reconciled and the U.S. survives as a nation. I think there's some need for entrepreneurial thinking there, of using more positive theories to support nation building in the United States and deal with the serious issues that the U.S. is facing as a society. Avoid the inflation of the China threat.
Then what do you think would be the characteristics of this intense competition, if it exists, between U.S. and China in the times to come? It's not all-out war. It's not like proxy wars, hopefully. Then what would be these areas of this gray zone of competition between these two great powers?
Well, I think we're going to see decoupling. So both sides are going to ensure that what they perceive as core products for their national security can be produced onshore or can be friend-shored or produced within areas that their navy can control. So I think this is a trend which is not going to change. So more onshoring, friend-shoring, and nearshoring. It's the end of the unrestrained globalization, right? So national security first. This is something we're going to experience. And I would say definitely we're going to see more balancing. So my understanding is that the U.S. is going to intensify alliances in the Indo-Pacific. That's a bit different from NATO, because there's this dilemma or this debate in the U.S. if NATO should engage with the Indo-Pacific, and you have the Democratic Party and the neoconservatives pushing for NATO in the Indo-Pacific, but you also have Trump and the more isolationist who they believe that NATO doesn't serve any role in Europe, and therefore the only American influence should be in the Indo-Pacific, and this is where the U.S. should engage more with Japan, South Korea, and perhaps some countries in Southeast Asia and India, Australia, to balance the Chinese. So more balancing, more strategic decoupling and deglobalization. I think these are two core trends that we're going to experience in the next decades.
But you don't think that the relations are going to improve?
Difficult. I mean, as I said, if we're prudent, and if prudence sophrosine prevails, this is what Thucydides wrote exactly about leadership. If leaders are prudent, so if the Spartans realized back in the 5th century BCE that they had no theory of victory, instead of declaring war, they could have engaged in domestic reform. And in fact, one Spartan statesman said that we cannot fight and win the Athenians on land because they're a naval power. We have to reform. We have to build a navy. We have to make our economy stronger. And then when we have a navy, we can renegotiate with them from a position of strength. And by doing so, maybe the Athenians would cut a deal with the Spartans and we had no war. So my point is, prudent leadership means focus on domestic reform, on internal balancing, on empowering the economy and the society, and then from a stronger position, talk sincerely with the other side about things that you perceive as divisive.
Would you say that the term Thucydides trap is highly politicized, and should people stop using it to refer to U.S.-China relations today?
Right. Well, absolutely. I think they should stop using the term Thucydides trap, but they should be really reading Thucydides because, the wisdom is there. And so if you think about Thucydides, he didn't only talk about structure, he also talked about domestic politics, and he also talked about leadership. Right? These are the three core levels of analysis that shape strategic decision-making and international outcomes. And from an IR perspective, classical realist perspective, and Tsinghua perspective, as a supporter of the Tsinghua school of thought in IR, I think leadership will play the most decisive variable for China-US relations. So we need more JFKs, we need more Deng Xiaopings, we need more statesmen or stateswomen with a prudent vision to manage this great power competition in an era of AI, in an era of mutual assured destruction, in an era of climate change, in an era of perhaps proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. So let's hope for that.
And Professor, you're also working on your recent book. Is it also going to be about the Thucydides trap, or you're deriving inspiration from other type of Greek history and mythology to write something?
Again, when I talk with an Indian or a Chinese, this is what I love, because we always think back in 2,000 years, 3,000 years, and we draw inspiration from the classical tradition, from the warring states, Kautilya from the Indians, or Themistocles from the Greeks, Thucydides from the Greeks, or Sun Tzu and other thinkers from China. So my book actually is using the model of Plutarch, the historian, his parallel lives, where he compared and contrasted the life of a Greek leader with the life of a Roman leader, statesman, and based on that he extracted some principles of leadership. And we're using the same model with my co-author to compare and contrast Themistocles, which was the founder of the Athenian naval strategy, of Athenian thalassocracy, the general that defeated the Persians in 480 BCE, the great reformer who took Athens from a landlocked state, from an agricultural society, and turned it into a naval superpower, with the life and leadership of Deng Xiaoping, the statesman who took China, a country poorer than India back in 78, poorer than most of African countries, and turned it into the second largest economy, or in PPP terms, number one economy in the world, and this superpower today. So we're comparing and contrasting how leaders, through reform, can affect international outcomes. By saying international outcomes, the polarity of the international system, the number of great powers. And Themistocles did that in the ancient Greek system by changing the polarity from Sparta, unipolarity, to Athens, Sparta, bipolarity. And Deng Xiaoping did that to the modern system by changing the polarity from American unipolarity to Chinese-American bipolarity. And hopefully in India, a leader will rise up to the occasion and help by reforming India, make the country more powerful, and by doing India more powerful, changing the polarity from China-US bipolarity to perhaps tripolarity in the future.
That's an interesting topic. When is the book coming out?
Hopefully about a year from now.
I'm looking forward to reading it then.